Welcome back to Sika Strength. Welcome back to Sika Stan. My name is Dara. I am one half of Sika Strength. Over here, we're really concerned with athletic development, strength training, power training, speed training, all that good stuff, and how we can enable athletes to do it better. Now, today we're answering one of the most common questions we get, and that is, how often should I max out? For the sake of this video, we're going to make it simple. We'll talk about your back squat because I think most of you are going to be back squatting quite regularly. And we're going to talk to three particular groups. First group is strength training athletes. Whether you're powerlifting, whether you're just enjoying going to the gym, if you want to be pushing your 1 rep max number up, this is your group. Second group, hypertrophy athletes. Bodybuilding athletes, people who are concerned with their aesthetic. Maybe you're just going to the gym so you can look better, so you can feel better because of that. Whatever it is, you're in group 2. And then the third group we're going to talk to will be athletes. So whether you're a track and field athlete, whether you're a rugby player, soccer player, football player, whatever it is, if you're an athlete and you need to get your strength numbers up, you're the third group we're going to be talking to today. Now, maxing out. What is maxing out? Well, in general speak, maxing out or finding a new 1 rep max or a current 1 rep max would be increasing the weight on the barbell until you can't lift it anymore. Or increasing the weight on the barbell till you do a rep where you feel like you can't lift anymore. This is just maxing out. It's as basic as that. You can talk about 10 RMs, 5 RMs, 3 RMs, 1 RMs, whatever it is. For the sake of this, maxing out is increasing the weight on the barbell in a single session until you can no longer lift it. Now, in terms of how long or how often or how frequently we should max out, what we're going to talk about today is the different periods in your season or the different periods in a training block when you should be maxing out. So it's not necessarily a thing of long-term planning in terms of year 1, year 2, year 3 of your development of strength training. What we're really talking about today is month 1, month 2, month 3. Then finally, to finish off the video and kind of round it off a small bit, we're going to talk about the general recommendations for maxing out. We're going to do a much longer video on this in some point in the near future, but right now we're going to give you a basic framework for what you should do in your max out session. Group 1 then, as I said earlier, is strength training athletes. Powerlifters, people who just like going to the gym to get that number on the barbell up. In general terms, these athletes are going to train in specific, well-defined blocks. So they're going to pick a program or design a program that will probably be 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 32 weeks in length. They'll run through that, they'll do a cycle of training, and that's it. Now, in this case, there's probably 3 times we can test the squat. We can test it at the start, so day 1 or day 0 values. We can test it at some period in between, and we can test it at the end. So for the strength training athletes, why would we test at the start? Well, firstly, it probably makes sense if we want to demonstrate success or we want to demonstrate clear progress. But in many times, we're testing at the start purely for a reason of giving ourselves some sort of baseline. Now, that's not me saying testing at the start is a good idea, because to be honest, for the strength training athletes, testing a 1 RM at the start of a training cycle is not useful, and it's probably not that beneficial or safe to do. So if we have an athlete, maybe they haven't trained in a few weeks, maybe they've been doing a different style of training, maybe they're doing a prep phase prior to this. If they're coming into a strength training block, and they're a powerlifter, they haven't been going close to 1 RM numbers in a while. They haven't been pushing those high intensity, low volume sessions. And so bringing them into that session, it's very unlikely they'll be either physiologically or psychologically prepared to put enough weight on the barbell to get a true representation of what their 1 RM is. Now, in terms of the physiological side of it, oftentimes what we get is a false baseline. So we might get somebody in, at the moment, or previously, they might have squatted 180 kilos. At the moment, they haven't trained in a few months. Maybe they'll squat 140 or 130, depending on how well they've maintained their shape. If we get that person in and they haven't trained in a number of weeks, it's very unlikely they're going to hit 130, whereas 130 is probably where their squat is honestly at. So this idea of a false baseline can be quite misleading and can give you false perceptions of how well your programming is actually doing. In this case, if we were to test that person at the very start of the cycle, yet allow them to train 4 or 5 sessions and test them again in 2 weeks, they could probably add 15 to 20 kilos to their back squat 1RM, and it is absolutely impossible that they've actually added that weight. They've just gone through a small bit of psychological and physiological adaptation. They're a small bit more prepared, but the actual meat vehicle they're walking around in has not gained 15 or 20 kilos on the back squat. They have just familiarized themselves with the test a small bit more. So strength training athletes, let's just call it as it is, testing at the start of a training cycle is not useful. Now, what can we do at the start of a training cycle to get a rough baseline? If you're buying a Sika Strength program or you're coming on the Sika Strength app, how do you find that 1RM number to put in there for your current maximum that you could do? Well, our general recommendation is take a week or 2 of standard training sessions, maybe going for moderate volume and moderate intensity. This will look like somewhere between 3 and 5 sets of 3 and 5 reps, starting at around 70% or 65% of your 1 rep max number, and over the course of around 3 to 5 training sessions, finding roughly what that 3RM number is. Now, I'm not going to be recommending you use a calculator once you find a 3 rep max, because finding a 3 rep max is the exact same thing as finding a 1 rep max. You're not going to be prepared for it. It's not going to be all that beneficial to do. But what it does allow you to do after you've done your 3 or 4 training sessions is it allows you to have an open and honest conversation with yourself as to what weight you could realistically do. So let's take that 140 as an example again. Maybe we came into the gym day 1, we did 5x5 at 80 kilos. Day 2, we did 3x5 at 95 kilos. Day 3, we did 3x3 at 100 kilos. And then once we got to 110 for a set of 5, it kind of got quite difficult. Now, in that case, you could probably say that, okay, I can do 5 reps at 110. That's quite difficult. So I can definitely do northwards of 120. Could I do 130? Maybe. Could I do 135? Probably not. These are the kind of conversations you can have with yourself. It doesn't take very long. Just 2 weeks at the start of a block or 2 weeks of prep will give you all the information you actually need. Now, the second case is testing at midway points throughout the training cycle. So if you've run one of our programs before, you've probably come up against a 10RM, or maybe you've come up against a 3RM or a 5RM for the squat. This is quite common. Now, why do these exist? Is it absolutely vital for your overall progression in the cycle? Absolutely not. Testing in these interim periods as you go through a 8-week block or a 12-week block or a 16-week block is there purely as a carrot for the athlete. It allows that athlete to see they're making progress. Obviously, in the initial phases of programs, you have to put in a lot of volume work, you have to put in a lot of hard sessions, and so it is quite difficult as somebody's getting to the midterm point of the training block. If you're doing back squats, you're doing a lot of 10s, a lot of 8s, a lot of 6s, a massive amount of weight on the barbell is kind of increasing from week to week. It can be quite disheartening because you're not really seeing that much progress. You're still at massively submaximal weights, and so oftentimes people just drop out of the training program. Now, testing at interim points in between this, if you get a 5RM or a 10RM as you go through the block, this will give you a very clear idea of how much progress you're making. Oftentimes you'll get people squatting 85% of their 1 rep max for 10 when they're around 4 to 6 weeks into a training block. This is an immediate positive feedback loop. Then in another few weeks they might do a 5RM. They might hit that 5RM at 90% of their old 1 rep max. Now we have these multiple points where throughout the training block they understand they're making progress. Now, this isn't just important for this particular block and keeping you on the rails for this block. What this can also do is it can help you for benchmarking in future training blocks. So if I have run the RTA2 squat cycle and I understood that last time after 4 weeks I got a 10RM of 140 kilos, this time when I go through it, if I get a 10RM of 150 kilos, I understand that I have made a significant jump in this interim period and that I should have a significant jump when I get to the end of the cycle as well. So the final point here, and I think this is what we're all here for, is testing at the end of a training cycle. How often should you do it if you're a strength training athlete? Well, you definitely should only do it when you finish a training cycle. So whether your training cycle is 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 32 weeks in length, you should not be maxing your back squat any more frequently than the length of a training block. So in my opinion, for general strength training athletes, around every 3 months is pretty ideal. So that's 12 weeks of training. If you're a powerlifter going into competition, then you probably want to stretch that even further and probably push that to around 4 months. These general strength adaptations take quite a while to get. You're probably going to have to gain some muscle. You're probably going to have to gain a lot of neuromuscular adaptation. You're probably going to have to gain a fair amount of skill or efficiency with the actual movement itself. And so there is 0 point testing your back squat any more frequently than every 8, 12, 16 weeks or around that. 2 or 3 months will give you a pretty good idea for where you're at. On to group number 2 then. So group number 2 are hypertrophy athletes, bodybuilding athletes, people who are concerned with the aesthetic. Should these people be maxing their back squat? No, they definitely shouldn't. So the real argument here pivots around 2 points. The first area we need to talk about is the advantage of high intensity strength training for the hypertrophy athlete. Now, I'm not going to get into an argument with anyone online here. The research here is very, very conclusive. Volume drives adaptation for hypertrophy. You don't need to make it any more complicated than this. Everybody in the world will become more muscular if they do high volume, slightly high intensity strength training. This is all you need to be doing. You don't need to make it any more complicated. If you look at stuff from the 80s, the 70s, these guys knew how to get big, they knew how to gain a lot of muscle, and that is the exact same thing we're doing now. So why would you test your 1RM number here? It's kind of like the interim tests with the strength training athletes. A bit of a carrot, see how you're actually progressing. Now, the real side of this is that the aesthetic athlete, the bodybuilding athlete, the hypertrophy-centered person has a quite difficult time seeing progress. So whether you're in a bulking phase, whether you're in a cutting phase, whatever it is, the changes you're seeing aren't that significant. They are quite small changes, mostly, unless you're absolutely blasting off. Mostly, they are small changes that are qualitative. So unless you're taking actual skin fold measurements every week, unless you're taking actual cross-sectional area measurements every week, you're not hopping into a DEXA scan to figure out how much muscle you're gaining. So obviously, if we have somebody and they really want to gain a lot of size, we'll get them to do simple tape measurements, maybe 5 points around their body. They might do them every 2 weeks. That will give you a good idea. Now, what can also be quite encouraging for those hypertrophy athletes who are spending their entire year working their ass off is that if we show them they're getting a bit stronger, it can just push them on a small bit. But generally speaking, we're not going to get any massive improvements in hypertrophy by pushing for a 1RM number. It's just not going to happen. Now, the second point here, and this is probably the more important thing, is that hypertrophy-based athletes aren't preparing their body for 1RM numbers, so they're not preparing their body for 1RM maximal attempts, and so we can get an increased risk of injury when the bodybuilding athletes go for those 1RM numbers. They're building massive muscle bellies, they're increasing the cross-sectional area of that muscle massively, but they're not necessarily increasing that muscle specifically for the aim of a 1 rep max number. We spoke earlier about how much volume they're doing, so they're probably not doing the faster twitch muscle fibers any favors. They're probably actually getting some shift towards slow twitch muscle fibers, and so because of that, that muscle belly itself, the actual fibers, aren't really well prepared for a maximal attempt where you have to contract everything at the same time and produce the most force you possibly could. Now, the other side of this is actual development of the tendons, how those tendon units and that muscle tendon unit actually interacts. Unless we're actually preparing the body for those 1 rep max numbers, we probably shouldn't be pushing for them. So if you're there and you're doing your slow eccentric lengthened partials or whatever it is you're currently jumping on that bandwagon, if you're doing that, that tendon isn't ready for you to dive on the bottom of a squat. It's not ready for you to set up and rip a barbell off the floor for 1 rep max pull. You're not preparing that muscle tendon unit for a maximal attempt. You're basically preparing that tendon unit to do more of the work it needs to grow. So how often should a hypertrophy athlete be maxing out? probably once a year, and they should probably be doing it if they decide to take a small couple of months out of their hypertrophy training and maybe push their strength numbers up a small bit. So it might be a case where they've done a big block, they've cut for competition, they've done their prep, they go to a bodybuilding competition, they take some time off afterwards, and after that time off they might want to do a strength training block, get them back in some shape, and then go into their general training again, or their specific hypertrophy training. Finally then, the last group we're talking about is athletes. So whether it's track and field athletes, whether it's field sports athletes, whatever it is, we all understand they need higher strength numbers. Most of them are in the gym, particularly in their off season, very, very aggressively. They're pushing those strength numbers up. They're not necessarily driving hypertrophy all that much. Obviously, there are side cases here where maybe football players, rugby players are really working hard on the hypertrophy side of things to gain size, whether that's specifically in the muscle groups themselves or just gain mass. But mostly, athletes understand they need to have higher top end strengths. Then whether they want to use that to just be more forceful on the pitch, or maybe they want to use that to produce more power and then have higher top end speeds because of it. Whatever it is, athletes understand they need to be strong. How often should an athlete test? Well, more than likely an athlete has a quite condensed time period where they're really going to be able to push their strength numbers. In that time period, we kind of need to be demonstrating success, particularly in the S&C world where you have probably two other coaches ahead of you. You probably have their main coach, whether that's a track coach or a head coach on a team. Then you probably have their position specific coach or their assistant coach. And then you have an S&C coach. In this case, you need to demonstrate success, because you can come back at the end of an off season and say, athlete A trained really, really well. Their squat's looking much better. Their deadlift is looking much better. They move so much better with a barbell. Coaches don't care about that. Coaches care that the athlete is stronger so they can do more of the actual sport or be better at the sport they're doing. And so in this case, you need to demonstrate some success. Now, mostly speaking, when we get an athlete for their off season, they've just murdered themselves for the period of their actual sport specific season. And so we're not going to push them for an absolute max at the start of a training block, but we will bring them in and get some baseline values. Now, those baseline values aren't necessarily going to be with a high bar back squat. We might just pick one or two variables to test. It might be a mid-thigh isometric pull if we have access to force plates in the ground. It might be something like a back squat to a box that's just above parallel. Whatever it is that we deem to be the specific movement they need to get better at, we'll bring them in and test them at the start of an off season. Now, we definitely won't test them as we go through that off season. Mostly we're lucky if we have an athlete for 2 months or 3 months of an off season. In this case, we really don't have time to be bringing them in, peaking them for a 1 rep max test, and then bringing them back down training again, peaking them for a 1 rep max test again. Mostly we'll understand their methods. These athletes aren't hyper specific strength training athletes. It's not that hard. We're not dealing with the 1% of 1% up at the very top where they've already done all the work in strength adaptation. Generally speaking, it's really easy to make athletes strong because they haven't been pushing strength for their entire year. Most of the time, their strength numbers will decay over the course of a season. Then we get to bring them back up in that period of the off season. Now, at the start of the video, I know I told you we're going to explain how to max out. And what I'm going to do now is outline general sets, general reps, and a rough idea of how that max out should go. Right, so these are very general recommendations. It's certainly something that if you have a 300 kilo back squat, it's going to look very different from if you have an 80 kilo or 100 kilo back squat. But the recommendations here, generally speaking, are the same. So obviously you do your general warm up to start off with, whether that's on an air bike, a rowing machine, going for a run, whatever it is. You get your heart rate up, you start sweating, you get your internal core temperature up, and you generally just do an actual warm up. So whatever you want to do, around 10 to 15 minutes is loads for this. What we then do is go from general warm-up to specific warm-up. So we get a barbell out, we set up the squat rack as we would, put the bar on our back, and we start doing some back squats. Now, at this point, 5 reps to 10 reps is loads. Empty barbell, you want to do at least 3 sets with the empty bar to make sure everything is moving right. And this is the period where if you start sitting down into those squats and the hips feel a bit tight, then in between those sets with the empty bar, we go and we do that specific mobility work. We've done a number of videos on mobility work over the years. Go and have a look at those, whether it's hips, ankles, whatever. I'd also recommend something like the Ready State or any of Kelly Starrett's stuff are absolutely phenomenal for the in-session mobility pieces you need to do. Now, once we've done that, we'll slowly start adding weight to the barbell. Generally speaking, we'll start off with what the inside plate is going to be. So whether that's 20 kilos and you're starting with 60, or whether that's 25 kilos and you're starting with 70, obviously this holds true as long as we have a 1 rep max number that is at least double what you have on the bar now. So if I'm starting with 60 kilos on the barbell, I want my 1RM to be 120 or above. If I'm starting with 70 kilos on the barbell, I want my 1RM to be 140 or above. Now, in terms of general recommendations, we usually recommend 10% of 1RM for every jump on the bar. So let's say you have your 200 kilo back squat, you'll start at 60, 10% is 20 kilos, so you go 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160, 180, 200. That's very, very simple. That's probably the easiest we can make it here. A 10% jump works very, very well. There's a couple of reasons for it. Firstly, that jump isn't so big that we're really being taxed between the 60% and 70% or 70% and 80%. These are normal jumps. We're used to making these normal jumps in training. Now, the second part of this is that if we were to take smaller than 10% jumps for most of our build-up, we're probably going to end up doing too many sets. So as we're building up, we start with 5s or 10s at the empty bar. We probably do 5s at 50%, 5s at 60%. Maybe we go to 3s at 70%, 3s at 80%. Then probably a double or a couple of singles at 90%, and then go for 100%. But we do not want too many reps here. We're not trying to get a workout in. We're not trying to gain valuable volume here. The only thing we're concerned with is being in good shape by the time we get to the 1RM number. Now, the other part of this is that we're trying to hit new PBs here. So it's not necessarily a thing where I'm just going to go 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. I'm probably going to do a 7th set and go 105, and then an 8th set and go 110, and then a 9th set and go 115. Whatever it is, we need to make sure you're not depleting those glycogen stores or depleting your overall energy reserve. So then when you get to that top number, you have plenty left in the tank to be smashing big weights. Now, if you want to be smashing big weights and you want to get your back squat number up, I cannot recommend highly enough the RTA 2.0 training block. You can try it for free. Just download the Sika Strength app. Set up an account, you'll have a look at the training block, see what it looks like. It's 2 days per week. There's both squat work and accessory work on both of those days. It's 12 weeks in length, and it will have all the stuff we're talking about here in it. It has some of those higher rep maxes as we go through the training block, so you can see the actual progression you're getting. And it also has thousands of athletes who have run it now at this point who've made massive progress. If you want to see some of this progress, then get on the app, get into the members group. You will see these PBs come in every single day. So if you're sick of your lighter squat and you want it to be better, check out the app. If you have questions for us, sikastrength@gmail.com is the best place to find us.